stronger than I.
Ain't shit changed, same motherfuckers every day, worshiping their chain, hoping fame and night inspire to his name. Tell him pipe down, need to stay in this lane, cause these bitches still choosy in their ways, all natural or weaving up their braids. But let little mama look fly, it's on the day. Nigga tryna check me on my shoe game. That was back in high school, roast the ass up, force a name brand. Gotta stay.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our new episode of Justice in All Black. Today we are going to carry out an interview with Erika Edwards, who is Associate Professor of History at the History Department here at UNC Charlotte, and author of Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women, the Law, and the Making of a White Argentine Republic. This is the cover. Welcome and good morning, Erika. How are you?
Hi, Oscar. I'm doing well. And thank you again for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Our pleasure.
Our pleasure.
All right. So, Erika, the book is right out of the oven, right?
Yes.
It was just published. And I would like to know first how you decided to write this book. What brought you to study Afro-Argentina? And how was the process of deciding and then writing the book?
Right. So, I mean, this is a book, this book has taken a long time to create and produce. And it's something that I often tell my undergrads, which is, study abroad. And the reason why is because it changed my life. And it's during, I believe it was my junior year in college, that I had the opportunity to go to Argentina, specifically Buenos Aires, to study abroad. And it was just being there for roughly about 6 months that I noticed that there was a lack of, I guess what I thought would have been kind of a diversity, a mestizaje, or some type of browning that I assumed was throughout Latin America. And not knowing anything about Argentina, I was shocked to see how European it was. But I had always learned, or I had learned, that slavery had existed throughout the Americas. So where was then these slave descendants? That's what I was looking for. So essentially, it was a very blunt question: what happened to the Black people? And that kind of led me on this journey. I got back to the United States, and was really just energized with trying to figure out what exactly happened. And that led me to graduate school, onward to the PhD, still with that question in mind. And 18 years later, a book is produced. So study abroad, if you get the opportunity, you never know how it's going to change your life. You just don't,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
That's an excellent piece of advice for all students. All right, Erika, and in the book you argue and you show how the process of whitening in Cordoba is something that was both led by the authorities, but also practiced by Afro-Argentinian themselves, and especially by Afro-Argentinian women. Tell us about this central theme and also this central argument about the process of whitening in Cordoba from the late colonial period to the early 19th century.
So I'm glad you really touched upon the fact that it was almost a two-part process, right? And that is really one of the things I wanted to emphasize, is that this wasn't a situation in which you're looking at kind of this victimhood taking place, right? But instead, specifically, African descended women partook in this process, right? And mainly it was to better their lives, the lives of their children, seek that type of privilege that was denied to them. And in doing so, that meant to quote unquote whiten themselves. Mm-hmm. So I did, and that's one of the things, again, I want to stress that I really wanted to make clear that this is not a sad, they essentially die off kind of story, but rather looking at how complex things are versus, levels of intimacy, questions of various types of relationships that are formed within this idea of intimacy, how they're able to negotiate their existence, right? These are all very, I want to stress complex ideas, and this is happening oftentimes just within the household. So I want to make that clear. And again, the focus was, or the goal was to seek this privilege that was denied to them. So you have these women doing that. Either they are breaking the law or they're following the law using whatever is available to them. But then on the flip side, you also then have the state, right, the Cordoba-based governing authorities, which could be those that were in civil authorities as well as ecclesiastical authorities that are also seeking then to create a almost model society. And this also is something I want to stress. It's not just happening at the end of the 19th century, but rather at the 18th century, you're starting to see these questions of civility, morality, the Enlightenment, all these things of trying to create order, right, in a very chaotic moment, the Age of Revolution. And so you have in these authorities that are looking specifically at African-descended women as kind of the pillars for the next generation to create these docile, moral, civil citizens, specifically during the Republican period. So this is where you find that education is becoming instrumental, creating the school for these Afro-descended girls. Again, because they found that via the mother, they could ultimately train these future citizens to be, quote unquote, less slave-like and black-like and more citizen-like / white-like. And this is one of the things I stress in the book as part of this institutionalized whitening.
So traditionally, when we talk about whitening, we are talking about this state-led process of whitening the Latin American republics around 1900, the end of the 19th century, early 20th. That's the period when scientific racism was peaking and it had the most scientific prestige. But you are showing how in reality, much earlier in the 19th century, right after Latin American independence,
Right.
We have the institutions pushing for this, the state and the ecclesiastical institutions, and black women themselves participating in this process, right? Now, on the black women themselves, so something that our the people watching this podcast will be wondering is, what is it that black women could gain by either whitening themselves, by choosing a different census category or a different status in court, or by choosing a whiter category for their children?
And very bluntly, first and foremost, is freedom, right? Especially for those that had been previously enslaved via these various levels of intimate relationships. Many of them were able to achieve their freedom. And of course, for their children, the ultimate goal again is freedom. And one of the ways to do that is to ensure that their baptisms were recorded in the Book of Spanish Baptisms. That alone then ensured that they would always be considered Spanish or white. Okay, so freedom was definitely the ultimate goal. And then for those that were already freed, the goal then was to ultimately be viewed as, individually, but be viewed as less of a person with this stain of blackness and more as a person who has whiteness. And whiteness meaning this privilege. So for those, again, that are free, they always are having to deal with the fact that they were, right, or have a mother or a father who was a slave. And so it's kind of constantly, you'll see this oftentimes, this mancha, this stain of embarrassment. And so if you can essentially change your status as a freed person, and become white, or as I'm sure we're going to talk about, become Indian later on. I mean, that ultimately like allows for you to be free from that past.
All right, and discuss the changes in the status of Black women, the changes in the racial categories they choose and that they try to achieve by being registered in a different baptismal book or by being granted a different category in court, you use this concept of calidad.
Yes.
Tell us about this concept of calidad,
So
please.
calidad, and I specifically chose to keep it in Spanish. Mm-hmm. Sometimes some of my colleagues and other scholars will try to translate it, but I just felt that it was best to keep it in Spanish because of how complex it is and the various layers that it ultimately brings out when we discuss individuals. Mm-hmm. So calidad literally is, quality, right? And especially for the colonial period in Spanish America, that is one of the ways to describe a person. But the quality had various layers. Mm-hmm. So it could be, for example, where you're from, in terms of specifically where you're living, your occupation, your phenotype. All these things came together to define and describe a particular person. Over time, these various components of calidad would coalesce more and more into a stricter notion of what we would call race today, this racial category, but especially in the colonial period, as it's starting to become more hardened, there's still areas in which people could manipulate that, specifically for women, and how they dressed and how they act, could allow for them to move up socially in this calidad scale, which was ultimately a social hierarchical scale. Mm-hmm. So we're hearing descriptions as Spanish, right? Espanol, which ultimately means white, but also honorable, oftentimes denoted by the titles don or doña. Mm-hmm. So it really denoted their level of society. Mm-hmm. Versus someone who would be considered negro, which oftentimes is denoted or equated to being enslaved, right? Those are the extremes. And then you have a bunch of other qualifiers that would define people specifically in Argentina, such as Zambo, mulatto, moreno, not as much. Pardo would be another one as well. Pardo is especially one that I try and discuss a little bit more in the book and how it transfers from specifically being just for Afro-descendants in the colonial period.
From castas to pardos.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. To then this everybody else, right? The othering of everyone. So either you're a pardo or you're a blanco. Mm-hmm. No longer Espanol, because that's a dirty word in the Republican period. Right. Nobody's Spanish. But you are now blanco or noble. These are the two kind of descriptions that were used.
And in addition to using the concept of calidad, in order to understand this process of whitening, you have chosen to focus on Black women specifically, yes. And you have chosen to focus on relationships inside of the household, yes. Right? Yes. Tell us about these two choices and the things that we gain by adopting these two choices.
So, starting with women, which it took me a while to get there. Because and essentially, this is built off of my dissertation, but essentially I took the dissertation and went back down to the sources to rebuild it. So because I figured that she was necessary, and the main reason why is because after having read so much of the historiography in Argentina, I found that she was absent in this specific process. Mm-hmm. And she was seen more or less as a victim, and the Black men died, and all she had left were the white men, and so she just, essentially miscegenation took place, and again, this sad walk down this level of disappearance, as it's often been referred to. Mm-hmm. And I said, enough. My sources are not showing that. Okay, she is a lot more active, a lot more complex, and she deserves to have more of a voice. then specifically, and this is not to take away from scholars that have focused on Afro-descended men, but more or less I said to myself, it's time to move beyond that. I didn't want to repeat that conversation or that narrative, okay, which is he is ultimately part of this sacrifice. He's, the wars of independence, individualistic type of motives to allow for him to move forward. And we find later on in life that a lot of those that were in the war end up becoming, to some extent, a prominent Black elite at the end of the 19th century, specifically in Buenos Aires. Great, but where is she? Okay, and so she's not really as much on the battlefield, but she is in the household. And these domestic chores and the domestic life is why then I had to focus there. Okay, so it's almost like going from these individual efforts on the battlefield, Black men, to the household, women, Black women, and then this collective notion of what she means in terms of the family. Because I constantly found that she was not only seeking privilege for herself, but whenever possible, her child was surely to follow. Right? I mean, this connection was very, I mean, I have various examples in the book where she's promised her freedom. No, let me back up. She ultimately pays for the freedom of her unborn child. So she's pregnant and she's already thinking ahead, right? And that's what I said, whoa, that's pretty interesting and something that has not been discussed. So that's essentially where it was coming from. And I had to go then to the household, look at these relationships, various levels of relationships between her and her slaveholder, between her and the wife of the slaveholder, her children.
A priest, between her and a priest.
Which is like, wow. We can talk about that case. And so, all these different levels, and of course, in her via the state, because the state is also starting to emphasize the family as a basic unit for social control and the creation of these model vassals / citizens.
So, for example, we hear about Bernabela or about Maria de la Cruz.
Ooh.
Tell us an example or two briefly about these women so that we know about them, because the book is full with fascinating characters, right? Tell us one or two of them, please.
So, I mean, each chapter begins with a vignette because I wanted to really draw in the reader, and you're talking about two of them right now. So, and in these two cases, you're looking at Afro-descended women that were involved with priests. And two very different endings, somewhat different endings, but essentially Bernabela is someone who is bought by Don Jose Lino de Leon, who is a vicar, actually, so pretty high up. And they begin this scandalous affair that lasts for years. I've got 600 pages worth here of good stuff to get through still. I, after reading this case, felt she was almost like the Chica de Silva of Argentina. So, you just cannot believe this happens. But essentially, they begin this love affair, and the issue at hand isn't so much that he is having these sexual, intimate relationship with her, because most priests had someone in that nature.
Mistress.
Yeah, mistress.
A lover.
Well, a lover, right? Because they're not allowed to get married. And the problem was that they were so open about it, right? And that's what the court case kept saying is, I mean, the audacity. You're walking hand in hand in the streets with her, like, open. You don't even go to the back door. You go to the front door. Like, what is wrong with you? And this priest is, first trying to deny it and saying essentially that this isn't happening. But, that's episode 1. By episode 10, because literally these are the court cases I keep reading, they run away together. She gets banished. Essentially, he promotes and allows for her to become this señora, right? Dressing a certain way. demanding, even though she was formerly a slave, demanding that other slaves now call her senora, demanding that they give her chocolate in bed. I mean, you're just like, this cannot be real, but it is. So long story short, it's just again showing that this relationship that was created allowed for her then to not achieve this privilege until, of course, they were caught, right? And in this case, she was able to have her child recorded in the Book of Spanish Baptisms. Versus the other case, Maria de la Cruz, similar situation, except for he had promised and continued to promise her freedom. This priest, Don Marcos, promised it, and it never happened. It resulted in 2 children. Now, what makes her case very interesting is her mother becomes her strongest advocate. So, shout out to mothers and what she was willing to do. This is a little bit later. This is now during the Wars of Independence, so people are very tense about social control. And the issue at hand is, as she's going to court and pleading essentially that she achieved her freedom because the mother was fearful that Don Marcos was going to take Maria away, is she crossed lines, jurisdictions, I should say. And so rather than staying within the church, the ecclesiastical court, she went to the civil court, and that was wrong. And she represented herself, all for her daughter. In the end, unfortunately, she was not able to achieve that freedom for her daughter. But in both cases, it's showing again the strengths of mothers and what they were willing to do in order to at least attempt to make life better for their children. And again, like you said, I've got so many of these throughout the book, and that's again what kind of pushed me to continue to say what is going on with these particular Afro-descended women in Cordoba. I want to stress Cordoba because it was a very small town, or small city, so I was able to actually cross-reference their lives in various types of documents. So I'd find them in the census, the baptisms, the death records, marriage records, and that's also what allowed for me to create this not create, but also essentially follow their lives.
Very good, Erika, very good. So, having taken this brief break, I wanted to ask you about the role of public education institutions in this process of whitening, because you also talk a lot about educational institutions in Cordoba, and it is something that strikes me as a bit of an understudied space for people who do Afro-Latin America, racial inequality, racial segregation, racial identities, right? What role do public institutions or educational institutions play in the process of whitening?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things I was shocked to find out about when it comes to Cordoba is that they have this orphanage for girls. It started roughly 1782. This orphanage continues to exist today, by the way. It still functions. This is not for girls. It's for both boys and girls. And I actually had a chance to visit it recently, and it's still there. And I was still hearing the kids playing. It's part of a school system as well. So that's what makes it even more exciting to have found this. But essentially, by the end of the 18th century, there was a push, both from the civil authorities and ecclesiastical authorities. Sobremonte, the governor, essentially, of the city and eventually the province, but then also San Alberto, who was a priest. And both of them together saw the importance of education for the poor. And so prior to that, education was essentially for the elites, essentially for men. I mean, you're looking at, universities, colegios, but they were for boys and essentially for men that were going to go into governing positions or the priesthood. And so now, at the end of the 18th century, which I must stress is really a product of Spain. Spain is the one that began this and started these schools for girls. And so it starts to trickle into the Americas, more so public education. And San Alberto, in my case, is the person who really promoted this and instituted it, in Cordoba. And again, the focus was going to be on the poor and specifically orphans. Why? Because this notion was that if we work with them and we rescue them, right, from any of the potential threats and risks of the outside world, we will create a better society. We will create a society that will make, well, essentially children, but adults that will be obedient, and also that, what's the word I'm looking for? They will also be, I'm sorry, this is gonna mess this thing up. Obedient, but not labor. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. Honorable.
No, not honorable, but when you're working a lot.
Hardworking.
It's
laborious.
Yes, laborious, but essentially they did not. The idea was to make them agents of the state that would be laborers, right? And the focus then would be that they're obedient, that they labor, and that they are moral, that they're civil. All these things had to come together, and the way to prevent any more chaos was to target these orphans.
Civility, morality, and obedience.
Obedience, and hard workers, right? Okay. Anyways, I'm sorry. So do you want me to redo that part?
No, it's fine.
Okay,
it's fine.
You'll go. Okay. So, sorry. But yeah, so that was ultimately the goal. And by targeting these orphans to create this obedience and to create this morality, civility, that would mean less stress on the state, because they do not want to have these vagos, these lazy people on the street causing any particular deviant behavior. The goal essentially is to get rid of moral ignorance. So, specifically with not only targeting orphans, eventually we will see that castas will be included. Okay, and in both cases, the notion is that within their household of freed people, there's no hope, right? The parents are lost, so that's why we have to take them out of the home and we have to educate them in these public schools. Okay, so then specifically when it comes to Afro-descended girls, and this is what I found very fascinating, is that they too then would play a role in the Republic. Their role then as Republican mothers was to ultimately perpetuate the goals of the state, right? We're going to create then obedient...
To be agents of the state.
Agents, right, of the state. Obedient boys that will eventually become citizens. Because this notion that the first couple years of anyone's life, the mother is so pivotal in shaping their character. And so I found it fascinating that they took upon themselves, and by 1811, to create a separate kind of classroom just for, now at this point, they would say pardas, which not only included Afro-descendant, but also indigenous girls as well. And so this really showed them this notion that they would play a role in the Republic, but then it was also going to be institutionalized whitening that was taking place. Right? We are going to make sure that distance between slavery and freedom is going to be widened even more so, and this notion of uplifting the race and helping them. You know, I have a vignette in which someone is freed, but the only way she maintains her freedom is if she continues to go to school.
And I would like to do 2 more quick reflections with you before finishing, because today we're going to have to finish. But first, why Cordoba? Why not Buenos Aires? Because you end up discussing that, right? But what do we gain by focusing on Cordoba as a city and not on Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina?
I know. Well, 2 things. One is I quickly acknowledge that there's more than Buenos Aires in this beautiful country of Argentina. And so I said, I need to move beyond this. And, for the last 20 years, which is really exciting, there's been a growth of Afro-Argentine studies, but 99% of it is still on Buenos Aires. And so I said, again, there's more than Buenos Aires. And by looking at another city or another area, we can then start to see the different levels of how geography, socioeconomic differences played a role in shaping, right, this quote-unquote white republic. And then also Cordoba, because of its rich data. When I went there, it's such an untapped, treasure. And I stress treasure in terms of how much information is there. You've got the complete run of the notarial records for the 18th and 19th century, all 4 sections of the city, just sitting there, right? And in incredible condition.
All right.
Shout out to the archivists of Cordoba, they've done amazing jobs, And I said, oh my goodness, how could I not want to then mine these archives? It was a great find, and so those 2 reasons. And then when I really got into then Cordoba and I started to see the differences, mainly the church's influence versus the lack of the church in Buenos Aires, the size of the city, so small, what does that mean in terms of intimacy, in terms of the relationships that, when they would have to trace back their generation upon generation, that they knew each other for, 2-3 generations. And here it was, people are still, well, I remember this and I remember. I said, this is what makes in the small cities, these provincial cities so important. And then, of course, Cordoba's overall importance during the colonial period cannot be stressed enough. Buenos Aires did not have that until later on. And Cordoba, from day one was the central point that connected the coast.
Right. And the Sierra.
Yeah.
And the Andes.
Definitely. All the way to Potosí, correct.
And in what ways or in what moments did you find Argentina, in your case study, the period and the cases and the people you looked at, in what ways and in what moments did you find more racism than what you expected? And in what moments and in what places did you find your city and your country to be less racist than what you expected?
In my study or today?
In your study, I would say. We can also talk about today, but
racist. Okay, so I'll be honest.
In the sense that when we approach Afro-Latin America, we expect a series of things: fluidity of racial identifications, racial identities being subsumed into national ones or sometimes muted, a strong interracial sociability, right? In what ways did those expectations materialize, and in what ways didn't they? In what ways did you find more racism than what you expected, and in what ways, or in what moments and places less than what you expected?
So I think that's a really good question. What I found, so positive and the negative notions of race relations, let's say that, maybe.
Yes.
Okay. So the positive was seeing how she was able to, via these levels of fluidity, make that jump. And continuously making that jump, especially when it came to marriage. Being allowed to even marry, right, your slave, and the church not only proposing it, but also defending it, right, gave her then that leg up. That being said, we're looking at very few cases in which that actually happened, but I was able to find that in some cases she was born, a slave, but, by the end of the 1830, census, she's a doña. So there is these moments that are taking place. I think what was shocking for me in terms of the negative aspect was, especially when I looked at the questions of the court and how, for example, just going back to Maria de la Cruz's, her mother, she's sitting here trying to get her daughter, try to free her daughter. and just
with witnesses.
With witnesses. No, actually, she didn't have enough witnesses.
Oh.
That was the problem. She had promised witnesses, but they never materialized. So, but more than that, it was just this. When I was reading this, and how the civil judge, was so just. Could not believe this slave woman had the nerve to approach him, and how dare you? You should know your place. And that was really hard to continue to read that case. Mm-hmm. I think that was really just like, oh my gosh, and in these times of this chaos, how dare you? You don't have a defender de los pobres, a defender of the poor. Mm-hmm. You're coming to me, and you're totally disregarding jurisdiction. Uh-huh. Who the hell do you think you are? So those moments that particular one was very difficult to read.
Or finding something that, well, maybe being the early 19th century, that kind of made sense, but it's shocking in the Latin American context to see segregated classrooms.
Yeah, that, for example, actually I didn't see it as a negative so much as not so much a positive either, but segregated in the sense that yes, they did still see a role for them, but it was going to always be second tier, right? Mm-hmm. But they were still going to have to play a role of being a Republican mother. Sure. Right?
Yes. Absolutely.
But yes, I could say that. Definitely seen that as segregated, but for the times, I still found it pretty.
There was still slavery.
There was still slavery going on, right? And they were only going to allow free African descendants to attend these schools. So I actually found it almost somewhat a little bit radical at the time. Uh-huh. Later on, just to give you a little bit more, so by 1853, you're looking at the end of slavery. By 1858, the Parda class is closed. So they closed the Parda class, and then they finally put them with another group, as they would call them, externas, the ones that had to commute every day. Mm-hmm. Now they're kind of put there versus the internas, the ones that actually lived on the premise and were part of the orphanage and also attended school. So, I mean, you still see this break and separation between the two. But because of the fact that this is the early 19th century, and it continues, even to today, I thought that was pretty radical. And you don't see that in Buenos Aires. You did have an attempt to create one, but by the 1820s, because Buenos Aires wants to get rid of the church, a different society takes over that realm, right, of public education society, the benefit society, I believe it's called, or something to that effect. And they then, go on to try and educate these girls and these orphans, but no to the church. Mm-hmm. Because of the strength of the church, which is another reason Cordoba is such a great counterpart to Buenos Aires, that continued, and like I stress, it still continues today, this school.
Hiding in plain sight, Black Women, the Law, and the Making of a White Argentine Republic, by Erika Edwards, published in 2020. Right? With University of Alabama Press.
Yes.
Already available to be bought online, in person. And I also think that there is an event this Friday to celebrate the book.
Yes.
Today is March 12th, and this event is...
March the 13th, my department, history department, thank you so much. We are going to, it's called a celebration of having the book published. So thank you, history department, my colleagues, which are wonderful people. We will be getting together tomorrow to celebrate. So.
Thank you very much, Erika.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you very much, all of you, for being there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.